Living God, help us to hear your word, that we may truly understand, and that understanding we may believe, and believing we may follow your way in faithfulness, seeking your honor and glory in all that we do. Pray these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
We're participating in what is called the season of creation, but we're not following the prescribed lectionary at all. That should come as no surprise. The season of creation, and I'm going to talk more about this in the sermon, I think is important because we are faced with an environmental crisis, and it is important to know in what ways should we as people of faith respond, and in what ways do our Holy Scriptures hold that way forward for us. This is not new material, but most of the time we haven't spent a lot of time on that, and I will take that other than a few times where we read the creation stories and talk about that. So today, I'm going to read two passages, the Genesis story, chapter 2, verses 1 through 4, and then Psalm 8. Let us listen for what the Spirit may be speaking to the church. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all their multitude. And on the seventh day, God finished the work that God had done. And God rested on the seventh day from all the work that had been done. So God blessed the seventh day and hallowed it, because on it God rested from all the work that God had done in creation. These are the generations of the heavens and the earth when they were created. And from Psalm 8. O Lord, our sovereign, how majestic is your name in all the earth. You set your glory above the heavens. Out of the mouths of babes and infants, you have founded a bulwark because of your foes, to silence the enemy and the avenger. When I look at your heavens, the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars that you have established, what are human beings that you are mindful of them? Mortals that you care for them. Yet you've made them a little lower than God and crowned them with glory and honor. You've given them dominion over the works of your hands. You've put all things under their feet, all sheep and oxen, and also the beasts of the field, the birds of the air, the fish of the sea, whatever passes along the paths of the sea. O Lord, our sovereign, how majestic is your name in all the earth. This is the word of the Lord.
Thank you.
So what does it mean to talk about or celebrate the season of creation? Well, the truth of the matter is, I will admit that this was actually part of a project that I was required to do in one of my doctoral classes. I don't tell you that to say I checked off an assignment by doing this. Moreover, I share this because in some ways I feel like I have had a bit of a transformation in terms of my own understanding to the ways in which creation theology is written from beginning to end if we just, as Jesus said, have eyes to see and ears to hear. We will in subsequent weeks hear things like the earth is an actual living, breathing entity. We hear this from other faiths, but the truth is written right into the Bible. It is there. I'm not going to talk about that today. What I do want to do is set the stage for where we will be going in the days to come. Some of it may not be new material, but in some ways I believe it's important for us to understand that the struggle for justice is written into the struggle for the environment. Because after all, the folks often most beaten down by environmental mess is what we now refer to as environmental racism. The truth is, you can't go very far these days without seeing the news of the latest unfolding event from the climate crisis. All we have to do is look to the continuing rising of the seas, the flattening of the Bahamas, the fires in the rainforests, the fact that there's still not clean drinking water in Flint, Michigan, the fact that there's an underground burning radioactive mess in Westlake just around the corner from us here. The fact is that our own government dumped chemical waste warfare in the 60s in the African American communities and then denied it for years. The truth is, though, that if you pick up the newspaper this week, and we actually were challenged in our class each week that we came in over the summer to bring in articles regarding the environment. And that was all we were asked to do. And that first half hour of class was the most depressing half hour I spent for days on end. Because it can be overwhelming. And when we're faced with the kind of crisis with which we're faced, it is easy to shut down and pretend and hope that it will just go away. And fortunately for Clint McCann, he would not let us do this. And I'm thankful for his wisdom as we've done it. The truth is that the research is very clear. We've radically altered the environment in which we live. I have read the quotes that if we wiped all the humans off the planet would regenerate itself and live fine without us. But if we killed out all the insects within anywhere from, a month to 6 months, we would all be dead. I'll talk about why I think that's important in a moment. If you spend the next week looking just casually for news stories and scientific stories about the environment, I promise that you will probably be as overwhelmed as those folks in the class were, and possibly led to some level of despair. If you've not been paying much attention, you know, even casually, that the news is not good. It's not a radical statement to say that we are living in a crisis that too many folks in power want to pretend like it doesn't exist. I'm not an expert at all in anything related to environmental science. I'm not an expert in policy, and I'm not interested in sharing the things I don't know well. But what I do believe is that our faith has some very important things to say about the created order and our place within it. I believe that when we say Jesus is coming back, too often our brothers and sisters in faith, our siblings in Christ, believe that we don't have to worry about the environment. We can let it go, because the sooner it's destroyed, the sooner Jesus is coming back. If you haven't heard that theology, it is unfortunately all over places within the Christian church. I've heard wings of the church even say, Jesus is coming back. Why should we care about the environment? And when it happens, what we're doing is bad theology, and bad theology has consequences. If you don't believe that, remember, you have to go back in history just a little bit, that the very man responsible for caring for the environment, the Department of the Interior, during the Reagan administration, was a guy by the name of James Watt. And he was setting policy. And he believed that we should speed up environmental degradation in order to make sure that Jesus would come back, because the earth does not matter. After all, right there in Revelation it says, a new heaven and a new earth, let's trash the one we've got. Setting bad policy was rooted in bad theology. That God was going to destroy everything anyway, so the crisis will just speed up Jesus' return. I really wish I was making this up, and I really wish I could share with you some of the looks I'm getting from folks who are thinking, you've got to be kidding me, or, yeah, I remember that. It's not enough to say we reject that. We have to know what it is we actually believe rooted in the text. And because of this, we need to dig deeply and think more fully about what our faith has to say, if anything. And that's why we're participating in what has come to be known as the season of creation. Even though the season of creation is only 4 weeks, we're doing it for 6. The reason 6 is because we were required in the first week of our class to come in and lift up 6 areas of the environmental crisis that we wanted to talk about. So it turns out that's what we're going to do. But it fits really well with getting at the heart of this overarching thing. We will not get to everything, but we will get to some major themes that I hope will help you rethink the ways in which you come to your decisions based on the text itself. We're not following the plan exactly, and that should come as no surprise if you've known me any length of time. But what I do want to do is continue to invite us to ask the question, what do we believe our faith has to say in the face of this crisis? Now, it's important to say, historically, around the conservationist movement, the environmental movement, the origins of it were rooted in deeply racist people. John Muir, Teddy Roosevelt, and Madison Grant all loved the earth. They loved the land. They loved animals. These are the folks who made sure that we had this beautiful national park system. Some of you might have seen the Ken Burns NPR or the Ken Burns PBS special about the national parks, and those were beautiful. The one thing that was left out was the fact that it was all rooted in the eugenicist movement. They thought non-white folks were lower than the animals, and were very clear about it and connected it with their conservationists. Why did they want the national parks? To make sure that the Native Americans weren't on the land. The push for national parks and created beautiful spaces for the American people, they meant white people. And they didn't want native peoples on the land. I wish I was making this up. All you have to do is barely scratch the surface to find it. It's the idea that white people love animals but really hate non-white folk. I'm sure you've heard that once or twice before. This is where it's rooted in. Even more recently, though, there have been a real distrust when the issue of environmentalism comes up because we bring up the concept of population control. Again, rooted in the eugenicist movement. And it always seems to focus on the non-white community and their problems with ability to control their population. It is there. In fact, it wasn't until the 1980s that it took Greenpeace and other organizations to drive some of these folks out who are now part of some of the white supremacist groups that we see on the rise, who also talk about the importance of the environment. So when we talk about conservation and the environment, I hear so often in majority white circles, why won't the black churches come and join us? You don't know your history. So we have to talk about the reality of this piece when we talk about caring for the environment, because so often it either means let's care about places in the country that no one will inhabit, but we need to care for those animals that live there, or we need to control populations, but we forget that environmental justice is not being done. No one mentions the water in Flint and thinks, oh, that's an environmental crisis. So as we work through our connection with the crisis, where our faith intersects with this important issue, we need to keep all of this stuff in our minds as well. And frankly, it comes as no surprise to any of us that the systems of race seem to impact every facet of our lives, even as we stand on the brink of a catastrophic crisis which no one can hide from. And now you must be wondering, when's he getting to the good news? Let me see if I can get there. Most conversations about the environment in the Bible focus somewhere around the passage that we did not read this morning, which is a little bit earlier. But it's referenced in Psalm 8. It's that moment where God says, here, you will have human beings, you will have dominion over the earth, the animals, the plants, the earth. You will have dominion. You say that word enough, and it sounds like domination. And those two words are not related to at all. But there are environmental activists who said that the problem with the environment has been the Christians. Because we've used this language of domination, or of dominion, and turned it into domination. The problem with the domination comment is it seems to put human beings at the very center of creation. That God created this beautiful, intricate, amazing world and then said, oh, the most important part here's the humans. Now, if you look closely, we come on day 6, sort of after cattle. So that should lay some of that to rest. Going to talk more about that later. And then, after this human gets dominion, that the rest of the creative order becomes something for us to use any way we want. Well, that's a horrible misuse of the Bible. My plan is not to address that any further, other than to say we reject the ways in which that's been interpreted. We'll get there, just not today. Instead, what I want to do now is to spend a few minutes talking about the simple idea that we can't begin to tackle or even understand the many issues until we stop. Until we stop. Because, and this is why I read the Sabbath text, because the very fabric of the creation story is the idea of Sabbath. The idea that stopping and appreciating what has been done is just as important as the work on the other 6 days. standing back and giving thanks. Yes, that is what Sabbath is about, but it's actually about something more. Sabbath is not simply about rest and relaxation or making someone else work when we go out to Sunday dinner. Sabbath was a way of setting limits. And we don't like limits at all. Sabbath was about setting limits, of saying that everyone in Sabbath gets to stop, gets to take a break. Now, why is this important? Well, if you get to the Ten Commandments in Exodus and Deuteronomy, it talks about why God proclaimed Sabbath there was that they lived in an economic environment that never allowed them a day off. I know this is hard to imagine. But in Egypt and in Babylon, right, the people of Israel could not stop working. And if they could not stop working, they could not begin to stop and think, wait, this is not how it's supposed to be. And here, they're called to stop. Sabbath was a way of setting limits, the opportunity to stop and take a breath and recognize that not just us, but our neighbors, those who might work for us, but not just that, the earth itself. The problem with Sabbath is that it just doesn't work in our lives. Environmental activist and Sunday school teacher, by the way, Bill McKibben. Some of you might have heard of him before, not his Sunday school teaching, but he's done a wonderful work on the book of Job and the environment. He said a great deal about most of the problems within the environmental crisis is our inability to recognize that there ought to be limits and boundaries in our lives. In our faith, it is written that there are always some level of limit. And any time that trouble comes is when we refuse to recognize that there should be limitations in certain areas. In fact, he says culturally, limits are seen as a problem. We can do anything we want. Anything we want. That's the idea, that we have that kind of power. But in a consumer society, we don't need limits to function. All we need is more people for the mill. Our culture revolves entirely around us leaving little room for anything else. No breaks, no stoppages. And here's the thing about our faith. Limits are written into every aspect of our faith. The narrative around the garden, right? God says you can have everything. You can have it all, except for one thing. By the way, it's not an apple. We're not sure what it is. But you just can't have that one. That's it. That's it. You can have all the other things, but just not that one. And we don't want limits. In the manna story, when they're in the wilderness, they're given all of this bread to eat. God says, eat all that you need. Take what you need. But if you hoard any more, it's going to rot. Guess what? People hoarded limits. Every 7 days, stop working. Don't make other people work either. And then, in the Leviticus text, I know you all have read Leviticus a lot, but Sabbath shows up in there in some really interesting ways. How does Sabbath show up in there? One, you'll like, debt forgiveness. Every 50 years, it all gets wiped out. I don't know how you run an economy without making somebody in debt, but apparently the Bible has other thoughts about that. Every 50 years, 75 years, gets wiped out. Everybody gets sorted back what they needed to survive, and debt doesn't go into perpetuity. But it's not just debt. It's actually the land. The little earth, we're going to talk more about earth next week, by the way, but the earth itself is called to take a break. Right? We know in the Sabbath text, in other places, that the animals are supposed to take a break, that they're not supposed to work, they get a break. Other people, even in, yes, the language in there about slavery, everybody gets a break. In these texts, even the dirt, the land, gets a break. Why? Because if you don't respect limits, the land can't produce any more food without more petroleum products. Again, that's a conversation for next week. So this idea about rest, right? In other passages, it's like, don't take stuff from the edges of your field. Leave it for the poor, the widow, the orphan, the immigrant, whether they're illegal or not. And then, the prophets, if you own too many houses, house upon house, you're in trouble. Limits. You don't need that many houses. And then in city planning, this is the crazy thing, there was a requirement to leave a belt of open space all the way around the city. Limits. Now, no one bothered to ask, well, why? Well, who knew green spaces were important when people were living in urban areas? Or something like that. The idea of limits. In the end, I believe, and I think this is why we started with Sabbath, is that it's a call for stopping, and it's not just about resting and getting ready for the week. It's about recognizing that it's a call for human restraint. We could, but should we? It has deep implications for the land, for the birds of the air, the beasts of the field, but our neighbor next door. So we begin this journey by stopping and stepping back, or at least in our minds hoping to, and in doing so that we can begin to see that this conversation around shalom helps us to be able to recognize that any time in the Bible that God starts talking about the created order, it's usually connected to the important call for justice. In fact, in the prophets, particularly Isaiah, and we're not going to go all there, but again, like we say, when we're trying to do a series, we're going to jump around just a little bit. Written in there is any time that injustice has been done to the poor, the widow, the orphan. It always seems to be drawn back to the fact that people have forgotten limits and stopped honoring the created order. But we've never been told this. I haven't. This was revelation for me. So we begin this journey. This idea to see that God's shalom includes not just the pastoral scenes in the mountains with the flowers and the fields, which are great, but shalom means communities. It's not about carrying the environment out there that we may never see. It is about that. But it's also about the environment inside of ourselves. Being able to stop and honor the gift that we have been given in our embodied environment, as well as those around us in our communities. When we stop, we can't see these things. But when we do, we can begin to get a sense that caring for creation means clean drinking water for our neighbors that we may not know. It means health care for people that won't put you in debt generationally. It means food, like real food, for people, not just because they're worthy, but because they're human beings, part of the created order, that deserve to eat too. That God's care for creation means lead abatement. It means safe streets. It means dealing with gun violence. It means safe schools. It means recognizing the interconnected web of connections that includes environmental care, that includes all of these things. Now, I'm not foolish enough to believe that Sabbath alone will solve the climate crisis, but imagine for a minute, just imagine for a minute what would happen if 1 billion Christians around the world decided one day to stop participating in the economies. Imagine just in the city of St. Louis, if all the Christians decided, we're not going out to eat today. Now, here's the problem I'm going to mention. What happens to all those folks who are trying to make ends meet by serving us on the days when we go out to eat? It's all interconnected. But imagine for a moment that there is the ability to make change. We say yes by stepping back to a creating God who laid the foundations of the earth. And in doing so, we might just notice that we're really part of the created world. It's not just out there. Isn't it nice to get out in the creation? But that we have responsibility to be part of. There is something each of us can do to be faithful in the midst of the crisis. I was going to share this story down the road. You'll get it again, but it seems like we could use a good news story about the possibility of change. So here's your story this morning. So some of you might remember the fall of the Soviet Union. When that happened, Cuba went into crisis because they were getting all sorts of support from the Soviet Union. And so they had to learn, all of a sudden, how to survive without the influx of the Soviet money and machinery. Now, the reason I'm talking about this is a few years ago, there was a scientist who decided to start looking at the coral reefs in the Caribbean. And what they found was there was only one place where the coral reef wasn't dying off: Cuba. And so they did core samples. For those who don't know, they take a giant drill, and go down in, and lo and behold, what they were able to see in that core sample was right about the time that the Soviet Union stopped sending them all the supplies for their agricultural products, they started to heal what was going on. So what happened was all these farms were using all the petroleum products for fertilizer, for bug control, herbicides, pesticides, all these kinds of things, and they just stopped using them. And so for the first time, they had to go to the older folks who understood how to farm without all of that stuff that had come in, and they, all of a sudden, 80% of their foods now in Havana is grown within a circle around the city of Havana. But in the process, they didn't even know that they would be healing the earth by stopping to use the farm chemicals. Literally, they brought life back into them. So we know that there are ways to do this. And people in Cuba did not starve because we changed the way that they did things. Now, I'm not suggesting that this is the way forward. What I'm saying is, in the face of the stories that you will look at and hear and read, it can be absolutely overwhelming. But there is something that each of us can do in this crisis. Do not despair. Do not be overcome. Instead, stop. Take a step back and think and decide and pray, what am I being called to do? And it's only, I believe, when we stop and reflect that we'll be able to know more clearly what we are being called to do at this time and this place. If we don't step back and think, and you might already be doing it. And that's why Sabbath is more than a commandment. And Sabbath is a gift. And if we can see it as a gift, we can begin to see in the stopping what we might have been missing. I was in class all of 4 days, 4 full days, I will tell you. And in that time, I found that I had been reading the Bible in a way that missed all of these creation texts. That missed this radical connection between the earth and yet all of the things that we talk about in terms of justice, all is written all into this. And if I hadn't taken that class and stepped back, I would have never seen it. And that's why I'm convinced that Sabbath may help us to take that stop, to step back and imagine what could be happening. And then, I believe, we will know better how to get back to work. Because indeed, we are called to work 6 days and then 1 day of stopping. Imagine seeing that as a powerful resistance to the environmental crisis. It is my hope in the weeks to come that you too will find a renewed sense of what does it mean to be a follower of Jesus in the face of this crisis. That we do not need to hide from, we do not need to be overwhelmed by, but we've got a lot to say if we just attend closely to the text that we've been given. Amen.